The Collins house was the kind of place you saw on postcards, a grand, slightly spooky Victorian tucked away on a leafy street in suburban New Jersey. It was beautiful, but the shadows seemed to cling to it, even in the late afternoon sun. I was 17, a high school senior, and babysitting was my part-time hustle. Easy money. Mr. and Mrs. Collins were rushing around when I arrived, their stress buzzing in the air. "Emily, thank you so much for coming last minute," Mrs. Collins said, adjusting her jacket. Mr. Collins was already halfway to the door. Their farewell was hurried and strange. "Lily's already asleep," he muttered, turning back just once, his eyes wide and serious. "Don't let her out of your sight no matter what." It was such a severe warning I actually paused. "Is everything all right? Is she a sleepwalker?" I asked, trying to sound professional. Mrs. Collins gave a tight, unnatural smile. "She's just active. Be vigilant. We'll be back by 3 a.m. at the latest." With that, they were gone, the heavy front door clicking shut behind them, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence. I decided they were just high-strung parents. The house was enormous and quiet. I checked on the little girl, Lily. She was 5, with dark, straight hair, tucked soundly into a princess bed. She looked angelic, totally harmless. I went back downstairs to the large, dimly lit living room, pulled out my calculus book and settled onto the antique sofa. That's when I noticed the wall. It was a gallery of framed family photos, all beautifully lit by a single spotlight. I usually ignored them, but the sheer number caught my attention. I stood up and moved closer. There were photos spanning 5 or 6 years, all of the Collins couple and their daughter, Lily. Only the girl was different in every single one. In the oldest picture, Lily had bright blonde curls and striking blue eyes. In the next one, maybe a year later, the child had wiry black hair and deep brown eyes. The Lily upstairs, the one currently asleep, had dark hair and a pale, serious face. It wasn't just a change in hair color. The bone structure, the eyes, the very shape of the children's faces were distinct. It was as if the Collins family had a new daughter every year. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. What kind of family was this? I tried to shake it off. Maybe they fostered children, or maybe it was a strange photography effect. I was just tired, but the quiet was getting to me. I went to the kitchen for a glass of water, and that's when I heard a soft creak from the hallway. I froze. I could have sworn I saw a shadow dart past the dining room entrance. "Lily?" I called out softly. Silence. I crept back to the living room. The couch was empty. I looked up the grand staircase. Nothing. A low, unsettling giggle drifted from the corner of the room. I spun around. Lily was standing right there, by the bookshelf, dressed in a faded nightgown. Her small face was entirely serious, and her dark eyes were fixed on me with an unnatural intensity. "You're supposed to be asleep," I managed, my voice suddenly shaky. She took a slow, deliberate step towards me. Her expression didn't change, but when she spoke, the voice was eerily deep, too gravelly for a 5-year-old girl. "Do you know?" she whispered, the sound dragging across the silence like sandpaper. "What's on the other side of the walls?" I couldn't move. The fear that had been a tiny knot was now an ice block in my chest. This wasn't a normal child. The blood drained from my face. Lily's voice, deep and scratchy, wasn't something a little girl could fake. I took an involuntary step back, bumping into the wall. "What did you just say?" I whispered, struggling to keep the panic out of my voice. Lily's eyes, still unnervingly dark, blinked slowly. When she spoke again, her voice was light and childish, the earlier rasp completely gone. I said, "I want a snack now, Emmy." The sudden switch was terrifying. I was questioning my own sanity. Was I hearing things? Was the house playing tricks on me? "Okay, sweetie," I said, forcing a smile that felt like a grimace. "Let's go get you a snack." I kept my eyes on her the whole time, guiding her toward the kitchen. She moved with an unnatural stillness, her small hand clammy in mine. While Lily sat quietly at the kitchen table watching me with those two dark eyes, I needed a distraction, an explanation, anything to make sense of the photos and the voice. I remembered the back staircase near the kitchen that led to the basement. "I need to check the fuse box, Lily. Stay right here, okay?" I told her. She simply nodded, but a tiny, knowing smile played on her lips. It was the smile of someone who had just won a small, private victory. I hurried down the creaky wooden stairs. The basement was a damp, moldy cave of forgotten things. I used my phone's flashlight, sweeping the beam across dust-covered furniture and cobwebs. Near the far wall, tucked under a low, bare bulb, was a sight that made my heart lurch. A collection of old porcelain dolls sat on a shelf, perfectly preserved and arranged in a chilling row. They weren't toys. They were displayed with a disturbing reverence. Each doll was different, some blonde, some red-headed, some with glass eyes and some with painted ones. But the horror wasn't in their appearance. Tucked around the neck of every single doll was a tiny faded ribbon with a hand-stitched name tag. Every tag read, "Lily." My breath hitched. The girl upstairs, the photographs, this macabre collection, it all screamed the same message. The Collins family had been replacing Lily for years. The floorboards above creaked, and I froze, imagining that fixed, dark stare boring down at me. I scrambled back up the stairs, my mind reeling. I had to leave. I reached the kitchen, ready to tell Lily I was calling my mom to come get me, when my phone screamed. It wasn't a call. It was a noise, a sharp digital screech that hurt my ear. I fumbled to answer it. The caller ID was blocked. "Hello?" I whispered. The voice that answered was a monstrous synthesis, a distorted, grinding sound that was male and female and neither all at once. "Run! She isn't Lily! Get out before midnight!" the voice commanded before the call cut out with another painful shriek. It was exactly 11:45 p.m., 15 minutes until midnight. I was shaking violently. I spun around, fully intending to grab the keys and run, but the kitchen table was empty. Lily was gone. "Lily, stop playing," I pleaded, my voice cracking. A soft scraping sound came from the end of the hallway. I crept forward, peering into the shadows. The air suddenly felt heavy, thick, and impossibly cold. There she stood, silhouetted against the dark landing of the main staircase. Her eyes were no longer just dark. They were now entirely, unnervingly black, pools of absolute night. She walked slowly toward me, and the deep adult voice from earlier returned, now laced with genuine malice. "You really should have listened to the nice voice on the phone, Emily," she said. Her head tilted. "The real Lily is inside the walls. You'll join her." And then I heard it, faint, high-pitched, and absolutely terrifying. The sound of a child sobbing and tiny fingernails desperately scratching coming from inside the wooden paneling of the wall behind Lily. The faint, frantic scratching from inside the wall was the sound of a nightmare made real. It cut through the paralyzing terror and slammed me back into my body. This wasn't a game. It was a hungry, ancient evil, and I was about to be its next victim. I didn't scream. I didn't think. Pure, desperate adrenaline took over. I pivoted instantly and bolted for the kitchen, the only room with a usable exit near the front of the house. Lily, or whatever was wearing her skin, was right behind me. I could hear the strange, shuffling pitter-patter of her feet and the low, guttural chuckling that came from her small chest. I burst into the kitchen, my eyes sweeping the countertops. My hand instinctively grabbed the first solid, heavy thing I could reach, a sharpened butcher knife from the magnetic strip above the sink. I spun around, holding the blade low, my entire body shaking with a primal fight-or-flight energy. Lily drifted into the doorway. Her black eyes seemed to absorb the dim light, and her unnatural smile widened. She wasn't running. She was approaching with the terrifying slowness of something that knows it has already won. "Stupid babysitter," the awful voice hissed. "The nice ones always go in the wall first." As she took another step, I felt a vibration, a persistent, urgent pulse coming from my pocket. It was my phone, which I had forgotten about during the chase. It was flashing relentlessly. For a split second, my focus broke. I glanced down and saw the screen. The flashing wasn't a text. It was an active call from the emergency number. The call I'd accidentally placed from the basement was still connected, and the display clearly read 911 dispatch. I fumbled the knife to my left hand and snatched the phone. Just as the demon child lunged toward me, I jammed the phone to my ear. A woman's voice, frantic and professional, screamed into the phone. "Stay where you are. We traced the call. Do not hang up. Help is on the way." The sound of a police siren, distant but growing, cut through the night. The effect on Lily was immediate and horrifying. Her face, already twisted, contorted into a mask of rage and distortion. The flesh seemed to stretch and tear at the corners of her mouth. She opened her mouth in a silent, impossible scream. Then, with a sudden, sharp pop, every single light in the Collins house went dead. I was plunged into absolute, suffocating blackness. I knew I had only a second. I didn't hesitate. I didn't bother with the door lock. I raised the heavy butcher knife and smashed the thick pane of the kitchen window, shattering the glass outward. The freezing night air hit my face and I threw the knife away. I scrambled onto the sill, ignoring the searing pain as shards of glass sliced my arms and legs. I pushed myself through the jagged opening and dropped 10 feet onto the hard, frozen earth below. I didn't look back. I just ran toward the sound of the approaching sirens, staggering down the quiet, shadowed street. The police arrived minutes later. The house was searched, but the Collins couple was nowhere to be found. They took my statement, a wild, unbelievable rant about dolls, black eyes, and voices in the wall. Later, I was told they had broken through the wall paneling where I had heard the scratching. They found nothing alive, but they did recover a terrible cache of history: tiny children's clothes, antique toys, and one small, dried-out bone. It was an ending for the real Lily, but a new, haunting beginning for me. I was treated for cuts and shock, and as the officers helped me into the back of the patrol car, I couldn't help but look back at the Victorian house. It stood silent and dark, mocking my relief. And in the brightly lit pane of the living room window, I saw her, Lily. She was standing there, a small, dark silhouette against the deeper blackness inside the room. She was looking right at me, and as the police car pulled away and the siren began to wail again, she raised one hand in a tiny, perfect wave and smiled. The house sat deep within the woods of upstate New York, an old Victorian monstrosity that seemed to absorb the twilight. As a 20-year-old college student, I, Sarah, tried to focus on the easy cash and not the fact that every window looked like a blank, judging eye. I was here to watch 6-month-old Oliver. The parents were nice, but clearly in a frantic rush. They barely made eye contact, handing me a small, portable baby monitor as they practically flew out the door. "Keep the monitor on," the mother instructed, her voice tight. "He sleeps most of the night." Their hurried departure felt less like a simple evening out and more like an escape. Oliver was a perfect baby, quiet and content. I tucked him into the crib in the brightly decorated nursery, adjusted the camera so the whole space was visible on the small monitor screen, and headed to the living room. I needed to catch up on some reading, but the quiet of the house was distracting. It was so silent that I could hear my own pulse. The only sound was the low, steady white noise from the monitor, indicating the baby was breathing peacefully. Around 10 o'clock, the tranquility broke. A noise drifted from the monitor's speaker, a faint, dry sound that was too distinct to be static. I leaned closer to the screen. It was a whisper. My blood ran cold. I couldn't make out the words at first, but it was definitely a human voice, low and urgent. I turned the volume up, straining to hear over the white noise. Then, clearly, terrifyingly, the voice sighed. "Don't look away." I slapped the mute button. The noise stopped, but my heart was pounding against my ribs. My first thought was interference. Old houses in remote areas pick up strange frequencies. I tried to rationalize it, reminding myself the parents had seemed normal, if stressed. Still, I had to check. I practically sprinted up the stairs. I threw open the nursery door. The air inside was warm and still. Oliver was fast asleep exactly where I had left him, his chest rising and falling gently. The room was perfectly empty. I swept my eyes over the shadows in the corners and checked the small closet. Nothing. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a sickening uncertainty. Had I imagined it? I went back downstairs, deciding to leave the sound muted for a while. I turned the monitor screen back on. The picture was still clear, a black and white view of the crib. I sat down on the sofa, trying to focus on my book, but my gaze kept snapping back to the small screen. That's when I noticed it. The camera's angle was slightly subtly different than before. It seemed to have panned closer to the crib, focusing on the dark corner near the window. And then, as I watched, the entire screen flickered and distorted, going fuzzy for a brief moment. When the image cleared, there was a fleeting, indistinct mass near the crib, a shape that looked exactly like a tall, thin shadow. I stared, breathing shallowly. The shadow paused, lingered by the crib, and then slowly, unnaturally, it seemed to melt into the wall. It was too fast, too blurry to be sure of anything, but the silence of the house suddenly felt less peaceful and more like a tight, waiting stillness. I knew then that whatever I was experiencing, it was definitely not radio interference. I felt a knot of dread twist deep in my gut, knowing that something was wrong with this house, and the baby monitor was watching it all. I couldn't shake the image of that shadow melting into the wall. My fear was evolving from a jump scare into a sickening certainty. I stared at the monitor, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced the shadowy figure would return. When it didn't, I convinced myself it was just a smudge or a trick of the old camera's light. But when I looked up from the screen, I heard a faint, rattling sound from upstairs. I knew I couldn't ignore it. I crept back up to the nursery. The room was cold now, much colder than the rest of the house. I swept the room with my eyes and saw nothing out of the ordinary, except for a small, ornate mirror hanging low on the wall, a detail I hadn't noticed before. I checked Oliver one more time. He was still sleeping, but his breathing was shallow and his little body was strangely rigid. As I bent over the crib, a low, unnerving sound came from the baby. It wasn't the gurgle of an infant. It was a rhythmic, broken whisper. I leaned in closer, straining to hear. "She's here. She's watching." He seemed to rasp, the words far too complex for a 6-month-old. I jumped back, utterly horrified. The baby monitor wasn't just picking up static, something was speaking through the baby. I stumbled out of the nursery and back to the living room, grabbing the phone to call the parents, or maybe the police. The minute I reached the sofa, my phone started ringing. It was the Collins number. A wave of sick relief washed over me. "Hello? Something is wrong. You need to come home." I started, but I was immediately cut off by a distorted, grinding sound, exactly like the voice from the first mystery call. It was the frantic, unnatural blend of a man and a woman screaming in unison. "The baby isn't yours. Run, before it's too late," the chorus of voices shrieked. I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. This was a warning, but from whom? And what did they mean? The baby wasn't theirs. I snatched the monitor from the coffee table, determined to turn it off completely and get out. But my gaze caught on the screen. In the tiny black and white feed of the nursery, I saw myself. Standing right beside Oliver's crib, I saw a figure that was an exact, sickening duplicate of me, Sarah. But my face in the monitor was twisted into a grotesque, malevolent grin. I was sitting on the couch, terrified, yet my own image was standing over the baby. The terror was absolute. I was experiencing a complete break from reality. I couldn't be in two places at once. Then I remembered the small mirror in the nursery. As I watched the screen, the duplicate Sarah slowly turned its head and seemed to look straight into the monitor's camera. It winked, a slow, deliberate movement of its eye. Then the true horror hit. The duplicate figure on the monitor slowly bent over the crib, and the sleeping Oliver suddenly began to thrash, not crying, but making a soft, whimpering sound. The duplicate reached down. Desperate, I grabbed the actual camera unit and ripped its wire from the wall. The screen went blank, but the silence was immediately replaced by a new sound, one that clawed at my last thread of sanity. It wasn't coming from the walls, not yet, but from the open doorway to the basement, a faint, eerie melody, like a broken music box playing somewhere deep down below. I knew that whatever entity was in this house, it had just taken the baby, and it wanted me to follow. The melody of the broken music box, faint and echoing up from the dark basement, was the most terrifying sound yet. Whatever was down there, the true source of the haunting, had taken Oliver. I didn't think about the butcher knife this time. I just had to get the baby. My fear had solidified into a fierce protective focus. I snatched the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and cautiously approached the basement door. It creaked open, revealing a black void and the intensifying, desperate sound of children weeping and tiny fingernails scratching. Not on the door, but from somewhere deep within the structure. I plunged down the rickety wooden stairs. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and something metallic. The music box melody led me to a cold stone wall. As I swept the flashlight beam over the damp masonry, I saw it. A small, almost invisible crack in the plaster. That's where the scratching came from. Driven by panic, I grabbed a discarded crowbar leaning against a support beam. I jammed the tip into the crack and began to furiously pry at the wall. Plaster dust flew everywhere. I was hacking away at the old house, the frantic sobs from behind the bricks urging me on. Finally, a section of the wall gave way, collapsing into a small, dark crawl space. I shone the light inside. Oliver was there, crying but alive, tucked into a deep, old wooden trunk that lay open on its side. I scrambled forward, grabbing the baby and pulling him to my chest. He was cold, but he felt real. As I turned to escape, the flashlight beam caught on something beside the trunk. It was a second, smaller object. A very old, outdated baby monitor unit. It looked antique, covered in dust and cobwebs, and had clearly been abandoned there for years. But then, the screen of the old monitor suddenly flickered to life. My heart seized. It showed the nursery, my nursery, but the space was empty. Then, into the frame walked my doppelganger. It was me, the duplicate from the other monitor, standing over Oliver's empty crib. The image was grainy, yet chillingly clear. I realized with sick horror that the first monitor hadn't been picking up a ghost in this reality. It had been broadcasting a live feed from another time or dimension, a reality where the entity did successfully take Oliver. The reality I had just barely averted. The creature I saw on the screen was a reflection of the evil in the house, an entity capable of mimicking and replacing. Dropping the crowbar, I scrambled out of the basement, clutching Oliver tightly. I didn't look back at the broken wall or the antique monitor's terrifying, flickering screen. I burst out the front door and ran, screaming the whole way down the long, shadowed driveway until I reached the main road and flagged down a passing car. The police arrived and the standard investigation ensued. Oliver was safe. The Collins parents were eventually located, completely mystified, claiming they knew nothing of a concealed space or an old monitor. No trace of the supernatural, the shadow, or the doppelganger was found. The official report cited babysitter hallucinating due to stress. I was safe, physically. But as I waited in the police car, my own phone began to vibrate in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out, my hands trembling. A notification was flashing brightly on the screen. Baby monitor connected. I hadn't reconnected it. I hadn't even re-downloaded the app. I instinctively opened the notification. The grainy, black and white feed filled my phone screen. It was Oliver's nursery. The camera, or whatever was running the feed, was clearly active again. And then she walked into view. The duplicate Sarah. She was standing over the empty crib looking directly into the camera. She raised her hand, not in a wave of goodbye but in a final gesture of possession. And then slowly, A horrifying, triumphant smile stretched across her face as she turned and began to approach Oliver's crib, closing the gap between the two realities I now lived in. The haunting hadn't been left behind. It was now a permanent application on my phone. The house loomed like a granite ghost in the small Midwestern town, its Victorian architecture barely visible through the thick, swirling fog. I'm Maya, an 18-year-old college student, and I took this babysitting job because the money was too good to refuse. As I stepped out of my car, the silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of gravel under my sneakers. The air was unnaturally cold. The parents, a nervous-looking couple, rushed me through the introductions. They pointed me toward the living room where their 6-year-old daughter was already asleep on the sofa, waiting to be carried upstairs. "We just have one rule," the father said, his voice dropping to a serious whisper, pulling me toward the main staircase. He pointed a trembling finger toward a dusty, unassuming door tucked into the upper landing. "Don't enter the attic between 10 and 12, under no circumstances. You might never return." The mother quickly added with a tight, unconvincing smile, "It's just an old family superstition, dear. We'll be back after midnight." They were gone before I could even ask why. I was a rational person, a student of modern science. A forbidden attic? It sounded like the plot of a terrible horror movie. I figured it was just their weird way of enforcing a boundary in a spooky old house. I carried the sleeping girl upstairs, checked on her, and returned to the living room. I settled onto the large velvet couch, pulling out my textbook. The time was 9:30 p.m. As the clock ticked toward 10, my practicality began to falter. The silence deepened, becoming heavy and oppressive. I kept glancing toward the landing where the forbidden door lay hidden. Right at 10 p.m. it happened. A sudden sharp gust of frigid air swept through the living room, even though every window was closed. I shivered violently. It was the kind of cold that felt like a presence. I hugged my knees, trying to convince myself it was just the old house's poor insulation. Then came the sound. A faint whispering drifted down from upstairs, so soft I almost dismissed it as my imagination. I held my breath and strained to hear. The sound was fragmented, like multiple voices speaking at once, but the words began to take shape. They were low, dry, and seemed to be warning me. I could just barely make out the repeated chilling phrase, "Don't come up. Don't come up." My heart started to pound. This wasn't static, it was clearly intentional. The warning I'd been given now felt less like a silly rule and more like a dire threat. My logic fought fiercely with the primal fear rising in my throat. Is this real? Or am I letting this old house get into my head? I stood up, unable to stay put. The curiosity was a raw, painful itch. I crept toward the staircase, drawn by the sound. As I reached the first step, I heard a sharp, unmistakable thud from the landing above. I froze. My gaze was fixed on the shadowed area near the attic door. And then, with agonizing slowness, a small framed photo that had been sitting innocently on a dusty wooden shelf slid forward and crashed onto the floor, the glass shattering loudly in the silence. There was no wind, no earthquake, and no one else was on the floor. The whispering stopped instantly, replaced by a sudden, deafening silence. I stood on the bottom step looking up at the broken glass, knowing that the thing I was supposed to avoid was now officially active. I stood petrified, staring at the broken glass on the landing, the image of the spontaneously shattered picture searing itself into my memory. That was no draft, and it certainly wasn't a joke. The house was pushing back. Yet, the distinct sound of a child sobbing softly now reached me, clearly coming from behind the sealed attic door. My protective instinct, stronger than my terror, took over. I couldn't leave a child trapped up there. I rushed up the stairs. The attic door, which had been tightly shut and firmly latched just moments before, now appeared to have swung inward slightly before falling back into place. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the cold brass knob and pulled the door open, stepping into the absolute blackness. The air inside the attic was dense and suffocating. I fumbled for the string of the single overhead bulb, but the light that flickered on was weak, casting vast, undulating shadows. I was immediately struck by the silence. The crying had stopped. I started walking, but the space was immediately disorienting. The attic looked much larger on the inside than it should have, stretching out into long, dim corridors lined with dusty furniture. As I moved, I glanced down at the dusty floor. A thick layer of undisturbed grime covered everything, yet there were fresh, clear footprints leading ahead of me, and they were exactly my size. I hadn't taken 2 steps, but the prints suggested I had already walked halfway across the room. My rational mind snapped. I'm losing it. I turned to escape, but the door I had just entered was gone, replaced by a solid wall of dusty shelves. Panic clawed at my throat. The house was reacting to me. The single light bulb above me began to flicker violently, matching the frantic rhythm of my heartbeat. I could hear the whispering again, louder now, and closer, seeming to emanate from the very plaster and wood surrounding me. "You came. Now you belong," the voice hissed, echoing from the rafters. I tried to follow the wall, searching for an exit. Suddenly, a flash of movement made me stop dead. Against a pile of old trunks, I saw a ghostly, fleeting image, a pale face with black, empty eyes. It wasn't the shadow of the house. It was the translucent face of a young woman frozen in silent terror. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, but I knew what I had seen. A past victim, one of the others who didn't return. The floor beneath my feet began to tremble, and the walls seemed to lean inward. I realized with devastating certainty that the house wasn't just haunted. It was a conscious, living entity that was morphing its own structure to trap me. I spotted what looked like a dark, steep stairwell and lunged toward it, praying it led down to the main house. As I did, the whispers intensified, filling my ears until they drowned out my own thoughts. Just before I reached the stairs, I caught another movement in my periphery. I looked over my shoulder and saw a horrific sight on the far wall. Myself. A ghostly duplicate of Maya, sitting in a rocking chair, staring at the ceiling with a vacant, twisted smile. The moment I looked directly at it, the image dissolved. The stairwell I was running toward suddenly shifted. The steps below the landing vanished into thin air, leaving a dark, gaping hole. The house had sealed my escape. The whispers were now a victorious roar, and I knew I was caught in a confining loop, trapped within a space that bent reality to its will. The roaring whispers of the attic mocked my panic. The stairwell was a void, the hallway was gone, and the floor was vibrating beneath my feet. I wasn't fighting a ghost. I was fighting the architecture itself. Invisible hands gripped my arms and ankles, pulling at me, urging me to give up and join the others. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe, to focus. I was not going to be another pale face in the wall. I pushed against the invisible resistance and began to crawl, feeling the house's life, its malignant consciousness pulsing beneath the wood. The whispers, now inside my head, called my name. Maya. Forever. Rest. Driven by sheer animal instinct, I ignored the spectral voices and the impossible angles of the room. I noticed a slight disruption in the dust near a massive antique wardrobe. With a desperate shove, I forced the heavy furniture aside, revealing a small, grimy window tucked low into the angled wall, almost hidden from view. It was small, but it was salvation. I didn't pause to think about the height or the glass. Grabbing a rusty hammer that had been on the wardrobe, I smashed the pane. The sound of the shattering glass was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The cold, fresh air that rushed in was a physical break from the house's suffocating madness. I scrambled onto the narrow sill, wincing as the jagged edges of the broken glass tore at my jacket. Just as I threw myself through the opening and dropped onto the cold, damp earth outside, a loud, definitive chime echoed from inside the house. It was the sound of a grandfather clock, midnight. I had made it out just as the forbidden time ended. Gasping and bleeding, I looked up at the attic window. Standing in the newly created jagged hole was the shadow figure, not the duplicate Maya, but a tall, skeletal silhouette. It was utterly still, watching me with a patience that chilled me more than the cold air. But the most disturbing sight was the house itself. In the dim, misty light, I could see the wall around the attic window shuddering, shifting, and sealing the break I had made. The plaster and wood seemed to flow back together like living flesh, repairing the injury. The house was alive, and it was healing itself. I didn't wait for it to finish. I got up and ran, adrenaline overriding the searing pain of my cuts, screaming into the fog until I reached a main road and flagged down a driver. The police were skeptical, finding only the frantic, sleeping child and a mysteriously broken attic window. They cited trauma and hallucination. I survived, but my peace was utterly shattered. Hours later, after I was checked out at the hospital, I sat shaking in my own apartment. I felt miles away from that house, but I knew I hadn't truly escaped. My phone, which I had somehow held onto during the escape, suddenly blinked. It wasn't a call or a text. It was a single new notification from an app I didn't recognize, flashing a stark red icon. I tapped it, and a message filled the screen. There was no sender, only a cold, confident promise. "We'll be waiting for you next time." The entity hadn't been defeated. It had simply expanded its domain. The house was no longer just a place on a hill. It was an infection that had found its way into my mind, and it had every intention of bringing me home. I was alive, but I knew I would never truly be alone again.